In August 1943, the sky over eastern England is already crowded before dawn, heavy with low cloud and the distant rumble of engines warming in the dark. And at RAF bases across the flat fields of East Anglia, American bomber crews move with practiced speed because the briefing they have just left behind was unusually quiet and unusually stark. The maps marked deep into Germany, the route lines extending far beyond the familiar limit where friendly fighters usually turn back. The red circles around the targets telling their own story. Regensburg and Schweinfurt, names that mean ball bearings, aircraft production, and the beating mechanical heart of the German war economy. And every man in those rooms understands that this mission will go where escort cannot follow, that the fighters which have guarded them over France and the Low Countries will not be there over central Germany, that today the bombers will be alone for the longest stretch yet attempted by the 8th Air Force, and that the plan itself is an experiment born of pressure from Washington and London alike. Pressure to prove that daylight precision bombing can break German industry without the need for invasion. Pressure to prove that the B-17 Flying Fortress can fight its way through by firepower and formation discipline alone. And as the first engines of the 4th Bombardment Wing and the 1st Bombardment Wing begin to roar in sequence, as ground crews pull chocks and step back into the darkness, the moment begins not with a single dramatic action, but with an absence. The absence of escort fighters on the far side of the channel, an absence that will shape every decision made over the next many hours, an absence that will test doctrine, endurance, and belief itself. And when the first fortresses lift into the low cloud and circle to assemble, the crews cannot yet see the danger that will meet them later in the day, but they already know it is coming, because the briefing officers have told them plainly, this is a mission flown without escort, and it will not turn back. The formation takes shape slowly, box by box, squadron by squadron, aircraft sliding into position by instrument and instinct, propellers biting at the damp air. The bombers climbing to altitude as the English coast begins to lighten with the coming sunrise, and the long lines of silver aircraft stretch across the sky like mechanical rivers flowing east, while radio discipline is enforced, and the interphone chatter is kept short. Because this mission requires concentration, and because every man aboard understands that once they cross the German frontier, there will be no fighters arriving to save them if something goes wrong. The plan is complex, designed to split German defenses by sending two separate forces to different targets, one heading toward Regensburg to strike aircraft factories and then continue on to North Africa, the other heading toward Schweinfurt to hit the ball-bearing plants and then return to England, a double blow intended to overwhelm the Luftwaffe's ability to concentrate. But the weather has already begun to interfere, the cloud layers delaying takeoffs and stretching out the timing between the wings, and as the minutes slip by on the ground, the carefully calculated intervals that were supposed to confuse German radar begin to blur, and the commanders in the air, men like Colonel Curtis LeMay, know that timing matters, because timing determines whether German fighters will face one force at a time or be forced to divide their strength. As the bombers cross the English coast and head out over the North Sea, the escort fighters appear as planned, Spitfires and Thunderbolts weaving above and ahead, reassuring shapes against the pale sky. And for a time, the mission feels familiar. The same steady engine vibration, the same cold creeping into gloves and boots as altitude increases, the same disciplined calm that comes from repetition. But the knowledge of what lies ahead sits heavy in every cockpit, because everyone knows the escorts will turn back, and the question is not if, but when. The channel passes beneath them, gray and unbroken. Then the coast of occupied Europe appears through gaps in the cloud, and as the formation pushes inland, the first flak bursts bloom at altitude, black puffs marking German defenses that have already been alerted. And the escorts stay close, darting at any sign of enemy fighters. But the Luftwaffe holds back at first, conserving strength, watching, waiting. Because German commanders understand the geometry of this mission too, and they know where the bombers must go. The bombers press on, engines synchronized, formation spacing tight, gunners scanning their sectors with methodical care, And then, as planned and feared, the escorts begin to peel away, one group at a time, turning back toward fuel limits and home bases, wagging wings in farewell, until, finally, there are none left, and the bombers are alone over hostile territory, deeper than ever before, the sky suddenly feeling larger and emptier without friendly fighters above. And in that moment, the mission truly begins, because now every defensive gun aboard every aircraft matters, every formation adjustment matters, every decision made by lead crews matters, and the margin for error narrows sharply. The German fighters arrive not all at once, but in waves, coordinated, deliberate, coming in from altitude and from ahead, head-on attacks designed to minimize exposure to defensive fire. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s flashing through the formations at closing speeds that leave only seconds to react. And the American gunners open fire in disciplined bursts, tracers arcing out and then disappearing, the sound of machine guns vibrating through the fuselage, the smell of cordites mixing with oil and cold air, and aircraft begin to take damage, control surfaces shredded, engines hit, windshields crazed. But the formations hold because doctrine says they must, because breaking formation means death, and because every crew has been trained to trust the box. The Luftwaffe presses the attack, rotating units, attacking, breaking off, climbing and attacking again. And without escorts to drive them away, they can choose their moments, probing for weakness, focusing on stragglers. And already the cost is becoming clear, as bombers fall out of formation trailing smoke, some turning back, some spiraling downward, some simply disappearing into the haze below. And yet the main force continues on course. Because the targets lie ahead, and because turning back without dropping bombs is not an option that has been given weight at this altitude, over this territory, with this much already lost. The Regensburg force pushes southeast, the Schweinfurt force presses east, and the separation that was meant to confuse German defenses instead leaves each force facing sustained attacks in turn. And as the minutes stretch into hours, the strain begins to show. Oxygen masks biting into faces, hands numbing on gun grips, eyes burning from constant scanning. And the radio remains mostly silent except for essential calls, because too much talk breeds panic, and panic kills. Over Germany, the flak intensifies, heavier, more accurate, the bursts coming at bomber altitude in dense patterns, shaking aircraft violently, punching holes through wings and fuselages, forcing pilots to fight their machines to keep station. And the bombers fly on through it because there is no other path, because altitude is protection, and because the targets are still ahead. The Regensburg group reaches its target area first, the aircraft factories coming into view through breaks in the cloud, and the bomb run begins, long, straight, and exposed, the worst possible moment to face fighters and flak alike. But the bombs fall as planned, the formations holding steady, the bombardiers doing their work under fire. And then the Regensburg force turns south, leaving Germany behind as quickly as damaged aircraft will allow, heading for North Africa and the hope of friendly fields and relative safety. But for the Schweinfurt force, there is no such release yet, because their target lies deeper still, and the German defenders know it. As the bombers close on Schweinfurt, the attacks intensify again, fighters coming in coordinated groups, exploiting every angle, every blind spot. And the flak over the city is among the heaviest the 8th Air Force has yet faced, the sky thick with bursts, the formations buffeted and torn, aircraft dropping out under the combined punishment. And still, the bombers hold course, because doctrine demands it, because training demands it, and because the belief that this effort shortened the war demands it. The ball-bearing plants appear below, sprawling industrial complexes that are small on the ground, but immense in strategic importance. And the bomb run begins under relentless fire, the straight and level approach feeling endless, seconds stretching out as gunners fight off attackers, and pilots fight to keep their aircraft steady. And then the bombs are away, thousands of pounds of ordnance falling toward their targets, and the formations turn for home. But home is far away, and the fighters are not done. The return leg proves as dangerous as the approach, because damaged aircraft are slower, formations are thinner, and the Luftwaffe continues to attack, knowing that fuel and ammunition aboard the bombers are not infinite, knowing that exhaustion dulls reactions, and knowing that every mile west brings the Americans closer to the point where escorts might appear again. Aircraft continue to fall, some forced to land in occupied territory, others crashing far from any help, and the crews who remain press on with a kind of grim determination that has nothing to do with heroics and everything to do with survival, counting the minutes, watching the fuel gauges, scanning the horizon for any sign of friendly fighters that will mark the beginning of the end of this ordeal. And when at last the first escorts do appear on the far western edge of Germany, it is not a moment of celebration so much as a moment of release, because the bombers have already paid dearly, and the cost is now fixed, written into the sky behind them. As the battered formations limp back toward England, the true scale of the mission's losses is not yet fully understood by those still in the air, but it is already clear that this experiment has been conducted at a terrible price, that the theory of unescorted daylight bombing has been tested against reality in the most unforgiving way, and as the first damaged B-17s cross back over the channel, engines running rough, crews wounded or missing, the question that hangs over the mission is not whether the targets were hit, but whether this kind of mission can be repeated, because the mission flown without escort has reached its most dangerous moment not at the bomb release, but now, in the long, silent return, with the costs still unfolding and the consequences not yet known. The uncertainty follows them across the water and into the landing patterns over East Anglia, because even as wheels touch runways and engines wind down, no one yet knows how many aircraft fail to return, how many crews are missing, how many are prisoners, how many are dead. And that absence of knowledge presses on the survivors as heavily as the hours of combat they have just endured. And as intelligence officers begin counting holes in aluminum, and men in formation rooms begin counting empty chairs, the pressure shifts from the air to the ground. Because the mission has proven something, but it has not yet proven what the planners hoped. And in the hours that follow, as the briefings stretch late into the night, the numbers begin to harden into facts, and those facts carry weight far beyond the tired crews who now try to sleep through the lingering vibration in their bones. The Schweinfurt force has taken losses that cannot be explained away by weather or bad luck, losses inflicted not in a single catastrophic moment, but steadily, methodically, by a defender who was allowed to choose when and how to fight. And as the reports are collated, it becomes clear that the Luftwaffe has learned as much from this mission as the Americans have, perhaps more, because German fighter commanders now have proof that if the bombers can be isolated beyond escort range, they can be attrited at a rate that threatens the entire strategy of daylight bombing. In the operations rooms at 8th Air Force Headquarters, maps are spread out again, but now the red pins marking missing aircraft cluster ominously along the routes flown without escort, and the planners who argued for deep penetration missions point to the bomb-damaged photographs that show Schweinfurt burning, production disrupted, machinery smashed, while the skeptics point to the casualty lists that continue to grow as late-returning aircraft are declared overdue and then missing. And the argument is no longer theoretical, because the price has been paid in crews and machines that cannot be replaced overnight. For the men who flew the mission, the strain does not end with landing, because many of them are called back almost immediately for debriefings that require them to relive each engagement, to recall altitudes, headings, attack angles, numbers of enemy fighters, flak concentrations, moments when formations wavered and then tightened again. And they speak with a careful precision that belies their exhaustion, because accuracy matters now, because these details will shape the next decisions, and those decisions will determine whether future missions resemble this one or diverge from it. In the mess halls and barracks, the talk is subdued, not celebratory, not bitter, but reflective, because the crews understand that they have done what was asked of them, that they reached targets no American force had yet struck in daylight without escort, and that they survived something that doctrine said was survivable. But they also understand that many did not return, and that knowledge tempers any sense of accomplishment. Meanwhile, across the channel, German commanders are conducting their own assessments, analyzing how their fighters were vectored, how long it took to intercept, where the bombers were most vulnerable. And they too see patterns emerging, patterns that suggest that the Americans will either have to accept these losses or change their approach. And this shared recognition on both sides marks a subtle escalation, because the battle is no longer about a single mission, but about the sustainability of an entire campaign. In the days that follow, the pressure from above does not ease, because Washington and London demand results, and the logic of strategic bombing does not allow for long pauses. And so, despite the losses, plans move forward for another strike on Schweinfurt, because the ball-bearing plants are too important to ignore, because the damage from the first mission was significant but not decisive, and because abandoning the effort would concede too much to the enemy. The crews hear rumors before they hear official orders, rumors of another deep mission, rumors that escorts still cannot reach the target, rumors that losses may be even heavier next time because the Germans will be ready. And these rumors spread quietly, without drama, because the men have learned to conserve emotional energy, to focus on what they can control, which is preparation and execution, not strategy. Aircraft are repaired or replaced, crews are reshuffled to fill gaps left by missing men, and training continues, emphasizing formation discipline, gunnery coordination, and the importance of holding steady under attack. Because if there is one lesson that can be drawn without debate, it is that isolated bombers die, and that survival depends on cohesion. As September approaches, the weather windows narrow, adding another layer of uncertainty, and the planners wrestle with timing, routes, and altitudes, seeking some combination that will reduce losses without abandoning objectives. But the fundamental problem remains unresolved, because the fighters still cannot go the distance, and the long-range escort that might change the equation exists only on drawing boards and in test reports. When the order finally comes for the second Schweinfurt mission, the reaction is muted, professional, and tinged with a realism born of experience, because the men who flew the August mission understand exactly what is being asked of them, and they understand that this time the Germans will not be surprised, that the flak will be heavier, the fighter tactics refined, and the margin for error even smaller. The mission briefings reflect this awareness, stressing again the importance of formation integrity, of mutual support, of resisting the instinct to break away when under pressure. And as the crews study the maps, the routes look familiar, almost uncomfortably so, tracing paths that have already been marked by loss. And yet the logic of the campaign pushes them forward, because the strategic calculus has not changed, and because the belief that sustained pressure can cripple German industry still holds sway. On the morning of the second mission, the weather is marginal, clouds threatening to disrupt assembly and timing, and as aircraft begin to take off, delays ripple through the plan, echoing the problems of August. And once again, the carefully designed coordination between wings begins to slip, creating gaps that German radar operators will exploit with ruthless efficiency. As the bombers cross into enemy airspace, the escorts again turn back at their limits, and the feeling of isolation returns, sharper now because it is informed by memory. And when the first German fighters appear, the engagement begins sooner, more aggressively, as if the Luftwaffe intends to settle the question of unescorted bombing once and for all. The attacks are relentless, head-on passes followed by slashing attacks from the sides and rear, and the American gunners respond with disciplined fire. But the volume of attackers is greater, the coordination tighter, and the flak over Schweinfurt has been reinforced, creating a corridor of fire that the bombers must penetrate twice, once on the way in and once on the way out. Aircraft begin to fall at a rate that is immediately alarming, entire squadrons taking losses that would once have been considered catastrophic, and yet the formations continue because turning back under this pressure would scatter the bombers and invite even greater destruction. The bomb run itself becomes an ordeal measured not in seconds but in endurance, the straight and level approach stretching out under continuous fire, and when the bombs finally fall, the relief is brief because a return journey lies ahead, and the Luftwaffe remains in position to exploit damaged and disorganized formations. As the bombers turn west, the attacks continue, fuel dwindles, ammunition runs low, and the sense of strain becomes nearly overwhelming because the crews are now fighting not just the enemy, but exhaustion, cold, and the creeping realization that the losses are exceeding even the grim expectations set by August. When at last the survivors cross back into escort range and then over the channel, the formations are shadows of their former strength, gaps everywhere, and the silence on the radios is heavy because there is nothing left to say that has not already been said in the air. The aftermath on the ground is stark. The casualty lists longer than before, the empty bunks more numerous, and the conclusion becomes unavoidable even to those who argued most strongly for unescorted deep penetration. Because the numbers tell a story that cannot be spun, and that story suggests that the current approach is unsustainable. As commanders and planners absorb this reality, the Schweinfurt missions come to represent not just bravery and sacrifice, but a turning point in thinking, a moment when doctrine collides with experience and is forced to change. And yet, even as this recognition spreads, it does not bring immediate relief to the men who must continue to fly, because the enemy is still there. The targets remain, and the war has not paused to allow for reflection. The escalation that began with the first unescorted mission has now reached the point where the strain threatens to break the system, and the question that hangs over the 8th Air Force as autumn deepens is no longer whether the bombers can reach their target, but whether they can continue to do so without losing the very force that makes the campaign possible, a question that remains unanswered as preparations begin for the next phase of the air war. The weight of that unanswered question presses down as the autumn of 1943 deepens, because the pause that follows the second Schweinfurt mission is not a pause of rest, but of calculation. And for the men still flying, it feels like standing on a narrow ledge while arguments echo above their heads. Arguments about doctrine, about technology, about whether persistence alone can substitute for protection. And in this space, the air war enters its most precarious phase, because operations do not stop, they merely shift, probing at the edges of German defenses, while the deeper targets are reconsidered, and every sortie now carries the memory of Schweinfurt with it. The bombers continue to fly missions into occupied Europe and Western Germany, still escorted part of the way, still alone at the edges, and each mission adds data to a growing body of evidence that shows patterns too consistent to ignore. Patterns that reveal where losses spike, where formations fracture, where German fighters concentrate their effort. And these patterns are discussed in briefing rooms and staff meetings with a seriousness that reflects the stakes. Because this is no longer about a single target or a single mission, but about whether the 8th Air Force can survive long enough to achieve its purpose. For the crews, the strain becomes cumulative because they are asked to fly again and again under conditions that demand constant vigilance, knowing that one mistake, one moment of confusion, one engine failure beyond escort range can be fatal. And this knowledge sharpens their focus, but also erodes their reserves, turning fatigue into a quiet but persistent enemy. Aircraft availability becomes a limiting factor because damage accumulates faster than replacements arrive, and maintenance crews work around the clock to keep battered fortresses airworthy, patching flak holes, replacing engines, checking control systems that have been stressed beyond their original design limits. And each repaired aircraft carries with it the scars of previous missions, visible reminders of what awaits on the next one. At the same time, the Luftwaffe adapts, refining its tactics to exploit every weakness revealed by Schweinfurt, coordinating fighters more effectively, improving head-on attack techniques, and integrating flak and fighter control into a more cohesive defensive system. And this adaptation means that even missions short of the deepest targets can suddenly become far more dangerous than before, because the enemy is learning, just as the Americans are. The imbalance becomes most apparent when weather or mechanical issues force bombers to lag behind or stray from formation, because those isolated aircraft draw immediate attention, and their fate reinforces the central lesson that cohesion is life and separation is death, a lesson that is taught not in classrooms but in the empty spaces left in returning formations. As November approaches, the pressure to resume deep penetration missions grows again, driven by the belief that German industry cannot be allowed time to recover and by the strategic imperative to maintain momentum. And yet, the memory of unescorted losses looms over every planning session, casting doubt on any proposal that relies solely on bomber firepower for survival. It is in this context that the development and deployment of longer-range escort fighters begins to shift from hopeful prospect to urgent necessity, because the limitations of existing escorts are now measured not just in miles but in lives. And the introduction of external fuel tanks and improved navigation techniques offers a potential way forward. But these solutions are still being tested, still being refined, and cannot yet guarantee continuous protection to the deepest targets. The near failure of the bombing strategy becomes a subject that is discussed carefully, often indirectly. Because to acknowledge it openly would be to question months of effort and sacrifice, and yet the evidence accumulates relentlessly, mission by mission, loss by loss, until it becomes impossible to ignore. For the crews, this period is marked by a sense of operating at the edge of what is possible, because every mission now feels like a trial not just of skill, but of endurance, and the question of whether the system will hold is present even when it is not spoken aloud. The weather compounds these difficulties because winter brings cloud, icing, and unpredictable conditions that complicate navigation and formation flying, increasing the risk of dispersal and making already dangerous missions even more uncertain. And when formations scatter, the carefully constructed mutual defense that underpins bomber survival begins to unravel. In the air, these moments are marked by sudden spikes of danger, when bombers find themselves exposed without the protective geometry of the box, and the response must be immediate and precise, because hesitation invites attack, and these incidents leave deep impressions on those who experience them, reinforcing the sense that the margin for error has narrowed to almost nothing. At headquarters, the near failure of unescorted deep penetration is no longer an abstract concern, but a pressing operational reality, and discussions increasingly revolve around how to bridge the gap between doctrine and survivability, how to maintain offensive pressure without destroying the force itself. And these discussions take place against the backdrop of ongoing losses that continue to exact their toll. The tension reaches a critical point when planners consider the possibility that without effective long-range escort, the deepest targets may have to be temporarily abandoned, a notion that challenges the core assumptions of the daylight bombing campaign and threatens to undermine confidence in its ultimate success. This possibility is not announced publicly, nor is it framed as retreat, but it influences decisions in subtle ways, shaping mission selection, route planning, and timing, as commanders seek to avoid repeating the worst outcomes of Schweinfurt while still applying pressure where they can. For the men who fly, these adjustments are felt as shifts in emphasis rather than explicit changes in strategy, but the underlying uncertainty remains because they know that the enemy has not been weakened enough to make the sky safe, and that each mission still carries the potential for sudden, overwhelming loss. The near failure becomes most starkly visible in the statistics that circulate quietly among senior officers, figures that show loss rates approaching or exceeding thresholds that cannot be sustained indefinitely, and these numbers force a reckoning because no amount of courage or discipline can compensate for a strategy that consumes its own means of execution faster than they can be replaced. As December approaches, the sense of operating at a breaking point becomes more pronounced because winter weather, adaptive enemy defenses, and unresolved escort limitations converge to create conditions in which another unescorted deep penetration mission, like Schweinfurt, would risk catastrophic loss. And this convergence brings the campaign to a moment of decision. The final turning point approaches not with a single dramatic event, but with the accumulation of evidence and experience that leaves little room for doubt, because the question that has haunted the 8th Air Force since August can no longer be deferred, and the answer will determine not just how future missions are flown, but whether the strategy itself can survive, an answer that is about to be forced by necessity rather than preference. That necessity asserts itself as the winter of 1943 closes in, because the accumulation of loss rates, operational strain, and strategic uncertainty finally compels a shift that has been building quietly behind the scenes. And this shift does not come in the form of a dramatic announcement or a single decisive order, but through a series of interconnected decisions that together reshape the air war over Europe. Deep, unescorted penetrations like Schweinfurt are halted, not as an admission of defeat, but as a recognition of limits that have now been measured with brutal clarity, and the focus turns instead to targets that can be reached with partial escort, to attritional battles along the edges of German airspace, and to the rapid acceleration of programs designed to extend fighter range and endurance. The experience of missions flown without escort becomes a central reference point in planning rooms, cited not emotionally but analytically, as evidence of what happens when bombers are left alone against a coordinated adaptive defense. And this evidence drives changes in tactics, formations, and priorities that begin to alter the balance of the campaign. Long-range escort fighters, particularly the P-51 Mustang, move from promising development to operational necessity, their deployment pushed forward with urgency born of loss. And as these aircraft begin to appear in greater numbers, equipped with drop tanks and refined navigation procedures, the possibility of continuous escort to the heart of Germany transitions from theory to practice. For the bomber crews, this transition is felt gradually, mission by mission, as the familiar moment when escorts turn back begins to shift farther east, then farther still, reducing the long stretches of isolation that once defined their most dangerous flights. And although losses do not vanish, the pattern changes because German fighters can no longer attack at will for hours on end without interference. The Luftwaffe, faced now with escorts that can meet them deep over their own territory, is forced into more frequent engagements that wear down experienced pilots and aircraft. And this attrition, combined with sustained pressure on aircraft production and fuel supplies, begins to erode the defensive system that had inflicted such damage on unescorted bombers months earlier. The lessons of Schweinfurt are integrated into a revised doctrine, emphasizing the inseparability of bombers and fighters, the importance of aggressive escort tactics that seek out and engage the enemy rather than merely shielding the formations, and the necessity of maintaining pressure even in the face of losses, but with a force structure that can absorb them. As 1944 approaches, the bombing campaign regains momentum under these new conditions, striking deeper and more frequently with a level of protection that had been absent during the unescorted missions of the previous summer and autumn, and the results begin to show not just in bomb damage assessments, but in the changing behavior of the enemy, whose fighters are increasingly drawn into battles that favor the growing numerical and technical advantages of the Allies. Within this evolving context, the missions flown without escort take on a distinct historical meaning because they represent the point at which belief in bomber self-sufficiency was tested to destruction, and through that test, a more effective combined arms approach was forged. The men who flew those missions carried their experience forward into this new phase of the war, bringing with them a hard-earned understanding of risk and coordination that shapes how later operations are executed. And although many of those who took part did not survive to see these changes, their role in forcing them cannot be separated from the outcome. Strategically, the shift proves decisive because sustained escorted bombing, combined with mounting fighter losses and increasing strain on German industry, contributes directly to the weakening of the Luftwaffe in the months leading up to the Normandy invasion, reducing its ability to contest Allied air superiority at the moment when control of the skies becomes essential to success on the ground. The resolution of the crisis triggered by unescorted missions thus unfolds not as a single victory or defeat, but as a rebalancing of methods and means, driven by evidence rather than ideology, and grounded in the recognition that technological and tactical adaptation is inseparable from survival. By the time deep strikes resume under escort, the question that once dominated planning sessions has been answered through action, because the bombers no longer fly alone into the heart of enemy territory, and the losses that once threatened to break the force fall to levels that can be sustained as part of a larger, integrated campaign. The mission flown without escort stands as a documented chapter in this progression, defined by its timing, its cost, and its consequences. And its immediate impact lies not only in the damage inflicted on specific targets, but in the transformation it compelled within Allied air strategy, a transformation that reshaped the conduct of the air war over Europe and altered the conditions under which the conflict would ultimately be decided.